Great. Yeah. So this is quite different. I'm going to be reflecting a bit on acquisition policy, gallery spaces, materials, audiences, and instead of going over the whole 100 years, I thought I'd focus around the 1850s and also look at some redisplays after that as well. I'm also missing out a lot of things, and I hope there'll be a chance to discuss some of the kind of themes that have been coming up about these changes in the scales of acquisitions, framing, wall colours, issues of maybe civic reputation and what acquisitions mean for national collections perhaps. And then this really important question of how these works are seen as fragmentary objects or as pictures, which is the very sanitizing word which is used a lot in the period that I look at. So as many of you know, the National Gallery was officially established in 1824 when the House of Commons voted to grant £60,000 to purchase the art collection and Pall Mall home of the deceased banker John Julius Angerstein. And William Wilkins's Trafalgar Square building was constructed between 1834 and 1838. And the new gallery was opened by Queen Victoria in 1839. And they were also sharing the building with the Royal Academy at this date. Despite earlier interest in Trecento painting from private collectors like William Roscoe in Liverpool and collectors like William Young Otley, whose collections the National Gallery now hold, the founding collection of the National Gallery did not include any examples from this period. The National Gallery's first director, Sir Charles Eastlake, was appointed in 1855, and he made the gallery's first Trecento acquisitions. And this really had a Vasarian emphasis on the progress of Italian art from Cimabue through Giotto and Masaccio to Michelangelo, Leonardo and Raphael. I'm sure this is not news to all of you. And this was his first acquisition, of course, attributed to Giotto in 1856. And then the following year, Eastlake purchased 24 early Italian paintings from the Lombardi-Baldi collection. And this included works attributed to Cimabue, Duccio, Orcagna, and Margherita d'Arezzo. And I'm showing you some little samples here, and of course, you'll all know the Jacopo Diccioni altarpiece is far larger than that. I'm just including the central panel here. And this group of paintings had been compiled and restored and framed for sale as a complete collection by this Italian collector and his restorer friend, with the intention of presenting this chronological sequence of artworks from the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries. There were some concerns before this date about the possible public reaction to the display of early Italian paintings as part of the National Collection. Anna Jameson, for example, writing in the 1840s, was worried about the effect that would be produced by the exhibition of an old Greek or Sienese Madonna, for example. And she imagines the sneering wonder, the aversion, the contempt, as we are far from that intelligence which would give to such objects their relative value as historic monuments. Eastlake defended his acquisition of the Lombardi-Baldi paintings to the trustees at the time, explaining that the unsightly specimens of Margheritone and the earliest Tuscan painters were selected solely for their historical importance and as showing the rude beginnings from which, through nearly 2 centuries and a half, Italian art slowly advanced to the period of Raphael and his contemporaries. And on their arrival at the National Gallery, this group of paintings was displayed together in a small room on their own. And this gives you some idea about the kind of values and the kind of purpose of this acquisition at the time. After the extension and completion of the Barry Rooms in 1876, the categorization of works by date prevailed. So they were still displaying things chronologically. They divided the Italian pictures into early Italian, Italian school, selected Italian, earliest Italian. So it all seems pretty arbitrary how they're grouping these works, really, but they are still thinking about it in terms of chronology. And the Trecento paintings were hung in the west vestibule here, which I'm showing you just off the octagonal hall. So this acts as a kind of cul-de-sac where visitors can venture for historical interest, but they have to retrace their steps to continue to walk around the gallery circuit. I hope you can see here I've kind of pulled out where these paintings were in relation to the rest of the collection. And within this room, the paintings were presented in a kind of quasi-chronology as well. So the left-hand wall, for example, had the earliest works with the so-called Cimabue, the Margarito, and this Byzantine Saints Cosmas and Damian, which is now in the British Museum. And they were framing the Sienese paintings as well. Another extension of the galleries in 1887 allowed the third director, Frederick Burton, and his keeper, Charles Locke Eastlake, who was the first director's nephew, of course, to rehang the collection according to what they termed scholastic classification. And in this new system of rooms, organised by regional school, which was, I guess, inspired by popular texts at the time, like Crowe and Calvo-Caselli, the Trecento paintings were then theoretically hung together with later examples of their school. However, because of this emphasis on obtaining works of the Tuscan Trecento, actually this display remained much the same. And the 1887 rooms look very like this room. So the Lombardi-Baldi collection acts as the kind of core of the early Italian, early Tuscan, early Florentine school. They're categorising a lot of it as Florentine, basically. And this, I'm not going to go any further in how these displays kind of continue to develop and further acquisitions now because of time. But the trustees who were responsible for acquisition of works, say around 1900, really felt that they had far too many early Italian paintings in the collection already, and they had no interest in buying any more, and they preferred to save up their money so they could buy very, very valuable works that were coming onto the market at the time, rather than making more acquisitions of this kind. Trecento paintings were presented to the gallery's viewing public, in the words of Ruskin, as the burning messages of prophecy delivered by the stammering lips of infants. Cook's 1888 guide to the collection described how the pictures in the early Florentine room stand in the same relation to the pictures of our own time as the stone huts of our forefathers to the gallery in which we stand. The poorness of the pictures here is the measure of the richness of others. To feel the full greatness of Raphael's Madonna, one should first pause a while before the earliest Italian pictures. And Cook also notes the social historical interest of these works as well, and I think it's important to emphasise this, and this is again after Ruskin, who's so important to how people are thinking about the national collection at this date. But they're thinking about paintings as a representation of the feelings of certain historical periods, and that includes these pictures which they described also as a kind of painted preaching. But this idea of Trecento painting still as the infancy, the prequel, the introduction to the rest of the gallery's collections still prevails. And here, this watercolour from 1896 and this photograph from the 1920s give you some idea of how earlier works are exhibited as this kind of in the vestibule and the kind of introduction to the main collections. I hope you can see what these paintings are. There were also other factors at play in contemporary considerations of how these works should be displayed and appreciated. And I'll just give a couple of examples here because they kind of relate to some of the things which were being discussed earlier about lighting and about how to design interior spaces. The German art historian Gustav Wagen, who famously curated the 1857 Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester, he was preoccupied with the museum interior and its possible role in helping the spectator to forget that they were seeing artworks outside of their original contexts. He argued that it was the duty of those entrusted with the arrangement of museums to lessen as much as possible the contrast which must necessarily exist between works of art in their original site and in their position in a museum, to realise in some degree the impression produced by a temple, a church, a place or a cabinet for which those works were originally intended and where a certain general harmony reigned. And this is interesting in the context of the Trecento works, I guess. The redesigns of the gallery that were going on at the time, the trustees were very much directing the architects to approach the interior design according to, I guess, Venetian palazzo models, and I guess they were looking for coherent interiors that would present as like the majority of the paintings in their sort of best context, if you like. So nothing like the simple Tuscan church interiors that we maybe have in the Sainsbury Wing today. And again, this thing that Eloise was bringing up about fragments is important here, I think. In these rooms that were being designed to hold the early Italian collections, these paintings were being shown as pictures, and frescoes were framed within gold frames, and they weren't engaging with these objects as fragments. The archaeologist C.T. Newton also made a case for Italian religious paintings to be displayed in low lighting to imitate conditions of a Catholic church. He suggested that the public were wrong to want their paintings well lit. Very many of the best paintings were painted for chapels and were probably seen under a dim religious light, he said, alone or only in the presence of a believing worshipper. And if one presented paintings in such a way, he argues, pictures would have a soul-subduing power, a sublime poetry, and its reality would become divine. In this particular case, he's actually talking about the Sebastiano raising of Lazarus, but it's possibly interesting to think about these ideas for the Trecento paintings as well. And the keeper, Ralph Vaughan, in his diaries record that he was actually messing around with the glass of the gallery. So he was painting the glass in the galleries to try and make the rooms a bit darker and to try and keep out the sun. And this diary record, it doesn't say exactly where he's doing this painting, but he was doing it in 1857, just before the Baldi collection paintings were coming in. So I wonder if there's a connection there. And this didn't last very long, and he removed the paint and started trying some other things instead, using blinds and different glass thicknesses and shades and all kinds of different things as well. And this kind of plays into the gallery's aversion to gaslighting. At the time, other galleries were doing evening openings and installing gaslighting, and the National Gallery really objected to this. And they even removed it from the galleries when the Royal Academy moved out. That's how strongly they felt about natural lighting. And this was also related to ideas of access and accessibility and the kinds of people who might come in the evening if they did open in the evening. So it's difficult to know how far these subtleties of lighting and display were appreciated at the time, but such issues were nevertheless being discussed, even if not explicitly in relation to the Trecento Italian paintings, and who knows how much these ideas were noticed. At any rate, I think it's interesting to observe that some of these questions and concerns surrounding the display of Trecento painting were already in discussion in the mid-19th century, even if the predecessors of the National Gallery had different assumptions about the levels of knowledge and aesthetic tastes of their audiences at the time.